I totally goofed off. I goofed, how you want to put it. I messed up last time. I goofed. And I can't believe no one called me out on it or noticed, but we totally skipped the second meditation. We covered the third meditation last class, but we pretty much skipped the second one. I don't know how I did that. I mean, talk about absent-minded professor, but I'm surprised no one noticed it. We really, someone said, yeah, Allison, I noticed. You're probably hoping I would just move on and get through it quicker. I know Descartes' he's not the most fun read. But so we got to go back. We got to go back and we got to cover the second meditation, but we kind of actually covered it indirectly. And so you'll see what I mean in a moment once I get into the lecture. So we got to go back and retrace our steps. And so we'll start actually with the second meditation, and then we're going to jump ahead to where we left off, right? Then we'll do meditation 4 and 5. So that's a lot on our plate. We're going to, again, recap, do meditation 2, at least the stuff that we kind of missed for meditation 2, meditation 4, and meditation 5. So that's a lot, but I was able to do it in my earlier class, so I think we can do it here. And we even got out a little early. We had a little bit of time left at the end. So for those of you who want to stick around and talk to me about your first essay or anything like that, you can do so. So that's the agenda for today, all right? So again, Descartes essay is due 2 weeks from today, which I think is October, what is it? Let me look at 29th or 28th. Let me look at my calendar here. The 29th, yeah, October 29th. So you can get started on it and turn it in early as you want, but that's when it's due.
I have a question.
Sure.
Well, I'll talk to you after class. I'll talk to you after class.
Yeah. If it's about your paper, you probably should wait till the end or whatever. We can.
You said the 29th for the next paper?
Yes. Yeah, for the Descartes essay. Yeah, that's correct. But maybe I'll go ahead and type that in the chat box. So that'll be more 2 weeks from today. So Descartes essay due October 29th. Okay. And you know how I am. I'll sometimes forget. I think there's already a due date up there or something, so it might be the wrong due date. This is the official one. So don't freak out if it's like says it's due October 14th or something. That's wrong, right? This is the right date. Let's see. Kayla, yes. So Kayla, I know this question kind of is just to you, but this also would apply because other students this happens. So what Kayla accidentally, she has a Descartes essay she's already worked on, and she uploaded it on mistake the first time, and yeah, you can turn that same one in. What happens though when you turn, I think what. I'm pretty sure the way the settings are, you can only turn in a file one time. And so once you submit something, if you made a mistake and you sent me your psychology homework instead of your philosophy homework or whatever you did, if you messed up, you're gonna have to just email me directly and just tell me what happened, because I have to go in and delete your submission and then resubmit a new one. And try to avoid that. I'm not saying be careful. Make sure when you're submitting, you know what you're submitting. But it happens. We all make mistakes. So if that happens to you, just email me with the correct file, and I'll go replace it. But yeah, what I'm worried about though in your case, Kayla, what I'm worried about with you, I'm worried that if you submit that essay, it's gonna come up plagiarized because it's in its database now. So we'll see how that works. But you might remind me when you turn it in what's going on. So when I see 100% similarity or something like that, I'll know, because it just tells me it's similar to some other student, and that student is you. So just remind me, and I'll okay, whatever, I'll figure it out. Okay, so sorry to waste a lot of time on just talking about papers, but it is important for the class. So, but let's go ahead. Like I said, I guess I'll get back to my PowerPoint here to get us situated, and I'm going to review a little bit, like I normally do, just to get us back up to speed. But what we really missed, what we didn't really get to see because of my absent-mindedness, skipping the second meditation. What we really missed was his argument for rationalism. So remember, I've mentioned this several times before. Descartes was a rationalist. What that means is that he thought knowledge was based on reason, on my ability to understand concepts and to make judgments based on that understanding. So this is a particular theory of knowledge. It's an epistemology, a theory of knowledge. And in the second meditation, he provides us with an argument for this view. So we'll talk a little bit, probably not, obviously not today, we've got enough to talk about, but we'll talk about another view, empiricism, a little bit next week when we're wrapping up Descartes. So like I said, Descartes' a rationalist. He thinks all knowledge is based on reason and understanding. The empiricist view says that knowledge is based on experience and primarily through our senses and through what we feel and think and have direct access to through our experience. So that's the alternative view. So again, the second meditation, that's the part that we really skipped. There's another part to the second meditation which we've covered, and I mentioned it several times in class last time. And so this one I don't feel like we really need to spend much time on today. We can really just focus on Descartes' rationalism. But the other part of the second meditation is his argument for the certainty of his self. So remember the first meditation, he doubts everything. You know, we get to this, what is it, the evil genius hypothesis, and he's under this assumption, right? He's making this assumption, he's operating under this assumption that everything he sees is an illusion, that his whole life is an illusion, it's all lies, everything he believes is untrue because there's an evil genius tricking him. So he entertains that hypothesis so he can doubt everything and then work his way back to certainty. He starts with himself. So that's another part of the second meditation. He says, well, I'm certain that I exist. Even if there's an evil genius tricking me about everything, I have to exist in order to be deceived. So at the very least, I know I exist. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I exist in Latin. And so, but he's still pretty skeptical at this point. All he knows is his own existence. He wants to get rid of the skepticism, and he thinks he can do this by proving God's existence. And that's what we talked about last class. We talked about the third meditation, where he provides a proof, or you might look at it as several proofs for the existence of God. And so this ultimately destroys, in his mind, this evil genius. There can't be a universe with an evil genius and God, especially if God is a good God and not a deceptive God. And he'll give us an argument for that when we get to meditation 4. So we'll see, you know, why does he say that, you know, he's proven God exists, but has he proven that God's not a deceiver? Well, we'll have to wait for that, the answer to that one when we get to meditation 4. But as I was saying, meditation 2, the part that we really need to focus on is not the part about his certainty of himself. That's important. But is this idea of knowledge being gained through reason, Descartes' rationalism. And so how does he establish this view? And why does he do it when he does it? It's sort of, this essay is pretty confusing. For people who aren't used to reading philosophy, it's a difficult essay. It really is. He's talking at a very abstract level. But even if you're following it so far, it's maybe not obvious why he seems to digress. He's just doubted everything. He's just shown that there might be an evil genius that's deceiving him. All he knows is his own existence. You would think he'd want to go ahead and prove God, like immediately, so that he could get rid of this evil genius theory and be done with it. And he doesn't do that, though. The first thing he does is he's like, well, what do I know? I know I exist. Well, what am I? I'm a thinking thing. But that's not much to know. I mean, what is a thinking thing? It's a thing that thinks, that has feelings, emotions, makes decisions, understands, misunderstands, has sense perceptions. there's not much I can say about the one thing I'm certain of. It almost seems like I have more knowledge of the physical things. I can say a lot more about my body. I can talk about, if you've ever taken a class in anatomy and physiology, you could probably describe your body in great detail and say many things and say you know them. But this is where he gets into this argument for his rationalism. He says, yes, perhaps that seems to be the case, but all your knowledge really, even of these physical things that you speak of, your own body, physical things out there that you think are out there beside yourself, all your knowledge of those things is based on your mind, on yourself. And he provides us with, I call this his wax example. He uses this piece of wax. It's a honeycomb. And he asks this question: how do I know the things that I know about the wax? This is an epistemological question, right? Having to do with knowledge. Where does my knowledge of the wax come from? That's the big question. Does it come from my senses? He asks. He doesn't think so. Why not? Well, let's look at the example. This is on, I think it's page 26. Let me find it here. No, it's 23, page 23. Right. So again, this is the part of the second meditation that we overlooked. We kind of skipped over this. Right. He's just proven that he exists no matter what, even if everything else is an illusion. Now he's going to show us that knowledge is gained through our understanding and through our mind, through our thought, not through our senses. Whoops, I misspoke. It's definitely not page 23. It's page 21. And it's the second paragraph. This is, again, the wax example I was talking about. He says, let us consider those things which are commonly believed to be most distinctly grasped of all, namely the bodies we touch and see. Not bodies in general, mind you, for general perceptions are apt to be more confusing. Instead, let's just look at one body in particular. Let's take, for instance, this piece of wax. It has been taken quite recently from the honeycomb. It has not yet lost all the honey flavor. It retains some of the scent of the flowers from which it was collected. Its color, shape, and size are manifest. It is hard and cold. It is easy to touch. If you rap on it with your knuckle, it will emit a sound. In short, everything is present in it that appears needed to enable a body to be known as distinctly as possible. But notice that as I'm speaking, I'm bringing it close to the fire. The remaining traces of honey are disappearing. The scent is vanishing. The color is changing. The original shape is disappearing. Its size is increasing. It is becoming liquid and hot, and you can hardly touch it. Now when you rap on it, it no longer emits any sound. Does the same wax still remain? I must confess it does. No one denies it. No one thinks otherwise. So what was there in the wax that was so distinctly grasped? Certainly none of the aspects that I reach by means of the senses, for whatever came under the senses of taste, smell, sight, touch, or hearing has now changed, and yet the wax remains. So how's he arguing for rationalism here? He's saying, so I know things about the wax. I know that it's wax, but do I know it through my senses? He says, no, it can't be through my senses. Why? Why is he saying that? Just by saying, so I'm looking at the wax, it's got a certain shape, a certain color, it has a certain smell, maybe it's kind of sweet tasting because it's still part of the honeycomb, but then when I take it, put it next to the fire, all those qualities change. Everything about it's different. So why can't my knowledge be based on my senses?
I'm assuming he's trying to say that like it could be something that's very similar to what you would know as wax, but it might not be definitively wax because something like, I don't know, I'm trying to find a good example of like putty or something.
Okay.
Could have similar properties to wax, even in other certain circumstances, but it wouldn't be necessarily wax, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So I'm guessing you can say that it can be misconstrued for something else with those same physical properties.
I think you're actually doing a better job than he is at being skeptical right now, because I think like he's actually saying, no, I know it's wax. I know it's wax. How do I know it's wax? But like he probably, with your example, like, oh yeah, you're right. Maybe it is putty. Excuse me. Maybe it is something with like a similar chemical structure as wax. But let's just assume that we know it's wax. If we did, he says, it couldn't be, there's no way it could be through our senses, given what he's just said about it, right? It's like, if I know that this is a honeycomb, and I know that this honeycomb is this wax, well, what happens when I melt it? It looks completely different. Everything that my eyes tell me, everything that my ears tell me, when I hit it, and everything that I'm being taught or shown by my senses is changing. It's all different, and yet I know it's the same wax. He says. But I like your comment. Like, maybe I don't know it's wax. Maybe it's putty. Mr. Skeptic over here, right? You're doing better than Descartes. But he's going to say, no, I know it's wax, and it's not through my senses. Because if I went through my senses, what would I have to say? According to his argument. Maybe this is not true, but he's going to say, according to my argument, if I went strictly by my senses and not with my understanding, which is ultimately what he wants to say, it's my understanding. I understand what wax is, and I understand what wax does based on knowing what it is. And then I know that when it gets hot, it melts. And so my understanding is what lets me know that. If there were no understanding and no mind, just senses, what would the judgment be? According to Descartes, I'd have to say, what? Is it really the same wax? Is there anything in it that is the same as it was before? I mean, I guess just the substance itself, but like, is the shape the same? Is the color the same?
Like, most of everything is different, but like, he's just stating that it's different when you melt it, and it's something else when it's not. So
you would
like,
have
he's
to,
just trying.
Say, you would have to call it something different, he would say. Like, if you didn't know it was wax and you didn't know, you had to say, well, this is a new object. It's something new. Every time it changed, you'd have to think of it as something else. And since you obviously don't do that, he says, it's not your senses that's doing that. Your senses are showing you different things. Every moment you see it different. As it's melting, it's constantly moving and changing. That's a puddle. And yet, well, I know it's the same wax. It's your mind. That's where the knowledge comes from, not your senses. And it's not your imagination either, says Descartes. There are a lot of things that we all know about wax. All of us know these things. And we didn't get to this knowledge through our senses, and we didn't get to this knowledge through our imagination. So what is he talking about? What's an example? Well, I bet everyone knows the answer to this if they think hard enough about the question. How many different shapes can I shape the wax into? How many different shapes can wax take?
I think like a lot.
Yeah. So there's a definite answer to this. That's you're coming close to it. How many? Is there a definite number?
Infinite.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, you can shape it however you want. It's infinite. And so we all know that. We're like, yeah, you can shape. How do you want to shape it? Just shape it that way. If there's a shape that exists, it can be shaped that way, right? Infinite. How do you know that, he asks? Well, you don't know that because of your senses. You didn't look at a piece of wax one day and watch it change into an infinite amount of shapes. You didn't see it. And you didn't sit there and close your eyes and imagine it. You didn't think, wax could be a ball, and it could be a square, and it could be a star shape, and it could, that would take forever. But yet it's true because of your understanding. Your understanding is what arrived at that. What he's calling your understanding, not your imagination, not your senses. So that's basically Descartes' argument for rationalism. He uses this wax example, right? Where does my knowledge of the wax come from? Not the senses. If I was going with my senses, I'd have to say it's a different thing at every second. It's changing as my senses report to me. and not my imagination either, because there are things I know about it that did involve this infinite use of my imagination. So it's got to be the understanding, the ability to understand concepts, to understand what wax is, what wax is capable of, that sort of thing. So he doesn't even know at this point, though. That's why I really like the comment earlier about the putty. You know, maybe it's putty. You know, how do I even know it's wax, right? The problem that needs to really be resolved now is, like, how do I even know there is wax? How do I even know there's anything? Descartes still hasn't quite answered this question. We're looking at the cartoon again, and we're still stuck in our minds at this point. He still hasn't given us an argument. He thinks he needs to do this. He needs to give us a good argument as to why the way things appear to me is anything like the way they actually are. You know, I see this tree, there's this object out there, it appears to me a certain way. How do I know that there's even an object out there, and it's not all just in my mind? And how do I know that the way I experience it is anything like reality? I know I make errors all the time. So unfortunately, he's not going to really get to an argument for that till the very end. So we're not going to be able to find out the punchline of this until next week, until we get to meditation 6. But he does start to examine the source of his errors, and he also, as I promised earlier, provides us with an argument for why God cannot be deceptive. Last class, we covered the 3rd meditation. We looked at his argument for why God must exist, and now we're going to look at, let me copy this, hold on. Now we're going to look at his argument for why God cannot be a deceiver, and it's very brief. So this is one we can kind of cover this pretty quick, and it's not exactly the main focus though of meditation 4. Why is this not working? Okay, there we go. That's what I wanted to do. Sorry, I got a little distracted there for a second trying to fix this slide. So let's look at this argument at the beginning of the 4th meditation, and let's see what he says. Why is it that this perfect infinite being that you've just proven, I mean, and again, some of you guys, I know some of you weren't convinced. I wasn't. I'm not a big fan of his argument for God's existence. I don't think it's that strong, but he's satisfied. So let's just sort of let him go with it. And to be fair, I don't know if there's really any good arguments for or against. You see all sorts of arguments for the existence of God and against it, and they all have their own flaws and shortcomings. But he feels confident that he's established the existence of a perfect, divine, infinite being. Now he's got to show us why that being would not be deceptive. So this is, let me find the page number here. It's pretty close to the beginning of the 4th meditation. He knocks it out pretty quick, so we don't have to spend too much time on it. It's the first paragraph, or the second, I guess, the second full paragraph on 36, page 36. It's really tiny. It's a tiny paragraph, like 2 or 3 sentences, and that's pretty much his argument. So let me read it, and maybe one of you can explain it to me. What is he basically saying here? Why is he saying that God cannot be a deceiver? So here's how he puts it. He says, well, to begin with, I acknowledge that it is impossible for God ever to deceive me, for trickery or deception is always indicative of some imperfection. And although the ability to deceive seems to be an indication of cleverness or power, the will to deceive undoubtedly attests to maliciousness or weakness. And so accordingly, deception is incompatible with God. So what's he basically saying there? Why would he say God cannot be a deceiver? What is it about God that he thinks is true that would imply that God is not a deceiver? I'll read it again. Listen up. I acknowledge that it is impossible for God ever to deceive me, for trickery or deception is always indicative of some imperfection. And although the ability to deceive seems to be an indication of cleverness or power, the will to deceive undoubtedly attests to maliciousness or weakness. Accordingly, deception is incompatible with God. So why can't God be a deceiver? What is it about him, about God's being, that makes it impossible for, or doesn't make sense for God to be a deceiver? God wouldn't do that.
I think what he's trying to say is God is so powerful. Like, why would he deceive anyone? Like,
Well,
that's what I get.
You're close, and that's actually part of the argument that I'm gonna mention an argument from Plato in a minute here that I think Descartes is drawing from, and that's something that Plato says, but I don't think he doesn't really mention power so much. He does believe that God is omnipotent, so he does think that God is all powerful, but it's not his power that Descartes seems to be focusing on here that makes him incapable of deception, or not wanting to deceive. He kind of says he's powerful enough. If he wanted to deceive you, he could. He's definitely could do it. He's capable of doing it. But why wouldn't he? It's not his power that doesn't seem to make sense. It's something else. Because people can be powerful and still deceive you. Power does not negate deception, I would argue, right? You can be powerful and still deceptive, even all powerful. So what's that?
I think what he means is, like, even though God is really powerful, he still can't control everything.
Well, no, I don't think he would say that. I think he does think, he thinks that God could control everything. He could. And he could control everything you do. He could control all your movements, but he doesn't. Right? He doesn't. Descartes doesn't think he does. But what? Okay, go ahead.
I think like he's powerful and perfect to be able to to want to deceive anyone.
Yeah. To me, and I think, well, to me they both might be important depending on who you talk to and how you think about it. But to me, the second thing you just said, you said power and perfect. And he's focusing on the perfect part. He says, a perfect being would not be deceptive. Deception is indicative of imperfection. Why would you if you were perfect, you wouldn't need to deceive somebody, I think is the idea, is sort of what he's arguing. And I say this argument, I don't know if he is intentionally doing this, or if he's doing it and he's not aware of it, but I have a feeling he's influenced somewhat by Plato. This reminds me a bit of the same sort of reasoning that you get in Plato's Republic in, I think, book 3 or 4. He talks about how the gods, Plato doesn't like the way the gods, the Greek gods, he doesn't like the way they're portrayed in many of the myths, because he thinks that they act all these weird ways that are very unbecoming. They cheat on their wife and they deceive.
Yeah, they're more worldly.
Right. And he says, yeah, gods are too worthy. Gods would not do that. They would not lie. They would not deceive. They're just and good and perfect. And so lying and deception is incompatible with divine, perfect, beautiful beings. And to me, I kind of see that makes sense. It kind of is intuitive. But if I'm being a hardcore skeptic here, and I think that Descartes, he should be. He said he would be. He said, I'm not going to accept anything unless it's certain. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. Maybe deception is actually good, and I just don't understand why it's good. Like, maybe God does deceive me, and it's good that he deceives me, and I'm just a human being, and I don't understand how deception is good. I see it as bad, So, yeah, I don't, I'm with them. I'm like, yeah, I mean, deception seems pretty bad, and it seems pretty like an evil thing to do, to lie to somebody. It seems like a perfect being wouldn't do that, but I don't understand the perfect being. For all I know, there is a good reason for it, But so, given that God would not deceive me, he turns to this next question about, well, if God wouldn't deceive me, and God created me, he thinks he's established that in the third meditation, that he was created by God. So if God would not deceive me and God created me, then why do I still get deceived? I'm still, I make mistakes. I often err, as he puts it. I make errors of judgment. That's why the title of the fourth meditation is Concerning the True and the False. He wants to know, why do I make false judgments? Why didn't God make me so that I could never make mistakes? Why didn't God make me so that I always understood things correctly and didn't make mistakes? And to me, what he's doing here, what Descartes is doing, is he's introducing us to the problem of evil. And this is an age-old philosophical problem. And he's doing it in a way that's very innocent. It's very, usually when you hear about the problem of evil, and I'll explain what that is in just a moment, usually when you hear it, it's in the context of ethics, not in the context of science and mathematics. He's talking about making a mistake at a math problem. Why do I forget to carry the one sometimes? Or he might be thinking of, his senses deceiving him. Why do I think that that's my friend walking towards me? And then when he gets up close, I realize it's not my friend. Why did I make that mistake? But usually when we talk about the problem of evil, we're talking about really horrible things that happen. Why, if everything was created by a perfect, all-powerful being, that's all-knowing, then why do evil things happen? Why do good people suffer a lot? It seems like you can point to all these examples of horrible things that happen to really good people. And sometimes on the other side, you have people who are really bad and evil, and they seem to prosper. And that doesn't seem fair. And so the problem of evil is trying to, that's the problem, and we have to address it. And it becomes, I guess, a little bit more complicated in Descartes' case, because he wants to say that, look, if God created me and God created everything, we need to explain why there are bad things. Why are there bad things? And he's got his own reasons for this. But whenever you come up with a theory, any theory, that is trying to address this problem of evil, we call this in philosophy a theodicy. And so that's a theory that is trying to explain why evil exists in the universe, even though there's a good God that could stop it. And so, why is it that and like I said, Descartes he's framing it in very non-controversial terms. He's just talking about making mistakes in his calculations, or making mistakes in his experience of seeing people, or optical illusions and stuff like that. But it's still basically the same problem. He's like, why did God make me capable of error? Or, why are there mistakes? And he's going to say, God would never create anything bad. Everything that God did is good. So any theodicy, any theory that I have to come up with, has to explain the existence of evil, and it can't blame it on God. We can't, God's good and the source of all that is perfect and infinite and good and wise and just. So whatever your theory, whatever your reason is for evil, for bad stuff, for mistakes, or any of all the above, you can't frame God for it. In fact, I think that's literally what theodicy means. Like, theos is the Greek word for God. Dice is mandate or stamp of approval or qualification. You qualify God, or you show why God is still a great being, even though it seems like there's a lot of evil stuff in the world. Does anybody have any ideas here how we might respond to this question? I mean, I'm going to give you the reason Descartes gives us, but maybe you have your own ideas. Why would you say that evil exists?
I mean, you could just say that God is not all good. Then I mean, like what's his proof?
Well,
he talks about
you're breaking the rules.
Things
you're breaking the. Although, to be fair to you, there are some theodicies that do that like, you know, but they're usually not Western, right? The more Eastern, well, evil exists because it's a balance and there has to be, and so the deities are not, you know.
I feel like
Is
it's
that,
more on
And
like
then,
I feel like it's more how would you know if it's right when you don't know it's wrong? Like
so
how would you
yeah,
know? So yeah, it's like how would you know if it's right when you don't know how to like I don't know how to explain it. Like
so
why
evil
would you
exists.
know
So evil exists so that we can know. So it's a matter of
what
knowledge.
is? Yeah, I think that's probably if there's no evil, how would you know that you're doing the right thing, or
but
like how
how?
would you know
But
But
that
maybe
you're
then,
on the right path? So I feel
but
like
then there's the
go ahead.
question of human. Like, okay, so when they talk about evil things or talk about bad things that happen, like you talk like sometimes catastrophic things. Like I know Voltaire, he started questioning his religion when the flood hit. I think it was Portugal. Like
Yeah,
it
it was
hit
like an
them, and
earthquake.
it just
Yeah.
it hit
Melissa,
earthquake,
yeah.
and it destroyed like a lot of the churches and a lot of the faithful's homes, but left the brothels standing. And it's like, well, is that evil? It's like a bad thing happened to people, but is an earthquake or some kind of act of nature, is that evil? So it's
Right.
like
Well, yeah.
how
Well,
can you assume?
maybe the way that it's termed problem of evil is a bad name. But still, you got to think like that example that you mentioned from Voltaire. You got to think, well, if God can do anything, couldn't He have made it so that the Lisbon earthquake did the opposite and like destroyed the brothel and, you know, and so you know, there's that's the sort of the conundrum. I'm glad you brought that example up though, because I was going to use more of a personal, you know, like what if you personally lost your child? You know, what if your kid died? You know, like let's say you had like a baby or a 4-year-old and they died of cancer or some horrible accident. You know, wouldn't you be kind of like angry? Like, why did this happen? This is a baby. What did they do to deserve this? You know, I need an answer. Why didn't God prevent this? You know,
Well, that goes into what I said. I think I said last class is where I said people like to lean on religion or a god to kind of like make things easier. So a lot of people, like at least when it comes to human error, they pass it off as, oh, God gave us free will, so if we commit evil, it's our choice and has nothing to do with God. But if something bad that you have no control over happens, then it's just a test or some path that you don't know is going down. So it can be tragic and it can hurt, but there's something greater down the line for you, so you can move past it and you don't have to
yeah,
question.
good. So those to me are the two most, I don't know if they're the most popular, but I think they're most powerful theodicies. And then I want to come back to what Rev was talking about. She was mentioning you can't really know what good is without evil. So let me just put Garden of Eden here just to remind me about that. But I want to comment on what you just said, and we'll come back to Rev. But yeah, so the free will theodicy, ultimately you're going to see that this is kind of where Descartes goes with it. That's what he's going to say. He's going to say, the reason I make errors and I make false judgments is because I have free will. And that's the origin for evil, right? And that's a typical theodicy. And usually the response to that theodicy is, well, what about floods? What does that have to do with free will? You know, why did all these people die in the flood or in the earthquake or in the tsunami? You know, what did they do? You know, like some of them were bad, some of them were good. Why, you know, why? And even if they were bad, did they deserve to be killed? You know? And so, but then you mention another theodicy. Well, wait, you have to go through a test. You can't just, we can't live in this perfect Garden of Eden. And this kind of ties into what Rev said. If there's no evil and there's no test, then it almost seems like, you know, if the whole thing is about reward and punishment, and that if you're a good person you should be rewarded and you're a bad person you should be punished, then if you have no free will, that seems to fall apart. It seems like if you don't have free will, then there's no responsibility. If you had no choice, then you could not have you could not have done otherwise. So why be punished or rewarded if you do good? So you got, you know, so free will is what allows you to do this, but it also leads to evil, and then again this idea of a test as well. In fact, I would say this is probably the most popular way to do a theodicy, at least when I talk to people who are, people of faith, and usually not congregation. I'll talk to people who are priests, pastors, things like this, and they'll typically use this sort of theodicy. They'll talk about, well, you got to think about, imagine if God were your father, a parent. Do you think it would be good if you as a good parent that he would protect you from everything? And that no matter what happened, you would never be harmed ever. Imagine if you had a parent like that. You think that would really be good for you?
I guess the reason why that may not work for some people is because, your parent is still fallible. They're still a human.
Right.
So,
well, I'm just using an analogy, like God is the perfect parent, right? He's the perfect parent, but the idea is that if you had a parent that was overprotective, you'd be spineless, right? You'd grow up like a weakling. So God has to throw these, tests at you to see if you're gonna stay through them,
But what about the theodicy of I think it's called positive nihilism, where basically God created the way that he made things the way they were, and just left a hierarchy for us to live through, and he left us. Yeah. So it's like if there's thing and thus whether bad things or good things happen are irrelevant to God. He just left things, so they just left paths for people to take. So
this is where
positive nihilism. Oh, sorry.
This is where I think that Descartes refuses to break from tradition. He's stuck to his Christian notion of God. Yeah, what you're describing sounds a bit like Aristotle, but I think that he would probably be pretty. I don't think he would like to have his philosophy called positive nihilism. I don't think he would. That's kind of Aristotle, but I guess it's a little different though, because Aristotle's God is not really a creator God. But what you're describing is like, God made everything, kind of put it in place, and then just kind of stepped away, and it's all working itself out. So I guess evil's not really on him. You might argue it still is though. You might argue, well, he made the thing. Couldn't he have made it so where it wasn't capable of developing into evil? And the whole.
I mean,
yeah. Go ahead.
You could also look.
Yeah.
You could also still look at it as something to over. It's kind of like the test thing, but it's not, because it's not really testing your loyalty or your faith. It's just things happen, and
make you stronger.
We have it makes you stronger. We have the tools to take that and become better, and maybe prevent it or circumvent it. And it just makes you better as people.
Right. There's a quote from, I think, St. Augustine. You remind me of that quote. He said something like, God allowed the evil to exist so that a greater good could exist. So it's like God didn't cause evil, but he allowed it. He allowed us to fall from the Garden of Eden, because just imagine the Garden of Eden scenario. If we lived in a world where there was no evil, there really wouldn't be any good, is the argument. There would be no heroes. There would be no evil to conquer. And as you were putting it, which I think is a more down to earth argument, is kind of like, well, it's not really a test, but it's like adversity breeds strength. This is kind of a Nietzsche point, right? Whatever doesn't kill me makes me stronger. So maybe war is a bad thing, and death and violence are bad, but they bring about good because they make us realize what's important in our nation, what needs to be preserved. I don't know. I'm just kind of riffing or whatever.
I think that's the better way to take it. It's like I had this conversation with someone about the Man of Steel Superman movie, and they was like, well, he didn't show up just automatically good. And I'm like, yeah, wouldn't you rather someone learn to choose to be good rather than just show up to be good like he was in the old movies? And it's like people say it's the ultimate sin that we took the apple, we listened to the to the serpent, to the devil, and took the apple. But it's also like, does it mean anything for people to have faith in you if they were programmed that way from the jump? Or does it mean for someone to be strong if they were programmed to be strong? They don't learn anything. It's like a genius that doesn't have any experience, or a prodigy that doesn't have any experience.
And please don't take this the wrong way. Please don't take what I'm about to say the wrong way. But one of the things you just said kind of remind me of something that the devil says in the book of Job. And it reminds me, I'm glad you said it, because it reminds me of another theodicy that we're forgetting. If you're familiar with the book of Job, right, he has to go through all this suffering because, you know, the devil's looking down at this man, Job, and he's looking at this man and he's like telling God, he's like, look at Job. This guy is he loves you, God. He's a very faithful servant. And God is like, yes, Job is a very good man. And the devil says, yeah, but look at his life. He's got a great family and a beautiful wife and all these kids. And he's got a big, you know, all his property with the farm and all these crops. And his life is prosperous. It's easy for him to like you, God. Of course he loves you. He's like, but I bet I could get him to turn away from you. I bet I could get him to denounce you. And God says, you can't do that. And then the devil goes down, and, you know, if you're familiar with the story, it's pretty gruesome. You know, he has his way with Job, and he, you know, he all Job's children die, and he gets sick, and his wife dies, and his crops fail. And he doesn't know why he's being punished. He just doesn't understand. And he keeps praying to God. And God was right. He never cursed him, and he was faithful. But he was still questioning, why? What did I do? And all of his friends and neighbors are just, they think he's an idiot. They're like, Job, you're a fool. You did something wrong. God would not be punishing you if you didn't deserve it. So, you know, God would not allow this to happen if it wasn't right. So therefore, you must have done something. And he's like, I swear I didn't. I don't know. And God shows up at the end and actually tells Job that he's right. He did not do anything. He's not being punished because he's a bad man. But why is he being punished? And God gives him a reason that is maybe not the most satisfactory reason, but it's the reason he gives them. And what does he say? Does anybody know this book from the Old Testament, Job?
I forgot.
You forget what he said? Well, he basically says, I can't tell you because you wouldn't understand. You know, so that's one theodicy. It's a mystery.
And that's the thing. It's like he didn't do it. He didn't create the evil or anything like that. He didn't create the hardships. But the expectation is for you to believe in him and Jesus as your Lord and Savior, regardless.
Yeah.
So it's like he gives you the free will so that you give him your faith unquestionably.
Right.
So even if the devil did do all those things, he told God what he was gonna do, and God let it happen. Because God's like, well, if he is faithful, if he's a true, you know,
Yeah.
if he's true to me, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah. But he tells him, though, there's a reason. He says, like, Job, there is a reason. Like, there is a very good reason, but there's no way you'll ever be able to comprehend it, you know, because I'm God and I do things and I have a plan, and it's a big plan. And that's kind of what Descartes says here. I mean, ultimately, Descartes goes with the free will theodicy. He says, well, why do I make mistakes? It's because I have free will. And it's better that I have free will than not have free will. It's better to have free will.
But then you remember.
Go ahead.
But then you remember it's written, you know, it's a written word. And then like it was written by man, not God himself. So that's where it's like, I've always, that's why I have that down to earth view of it.
Yeah,
Like,
I'm not saying, look, I'm a pretty secular thinking person myself. I'm not religious at all, but I think just the book of Job is just a story, but it's an interesting thought experiment. You know, it's like, well, wait a minute. You know, it's like,
definitely.
You know, it's like, why? You know, people. I know that's happened. I've seen that. I mean, it's kind of extreme. They kind of take it to extremes, but like horrible stuff happens in this world. If you watch the news, and I recommend actually watching like the news, not like your Facebook or Twitter feed, but like, you know, actually go try to watch like BBC, you know, and the newsreel. Man, there's the evil stuff happens to people that like, man, it's screwed up, genocide, horrible stuff. We're all familiar with this stuff if we look around enough. And so the idea is, well, why? And, you know, for Descartes, he says, well, you know, I personally make errors of judgment because of my freedom, and it's good that I have freedom. It's better that I have than I don't. And that we could debate. I guess if you're writing a paper that you want to critique Descartes, I think I could argue, yeah, I'd rather have free will than not be pre-programmed, but that's kind of a selfish want. I want it because I like to be responsible for my actions and be proud of them. But isn't that just my ego? Maybe like if I didn't have free will, but I was programmed to always be good and everybody else was programmed to be good, wouldn't that maybe be a better world?
I mean, but then you could say the same thing of God, because God allowed us to have free will. He allowed us to be deprogrammed.
Right, but I think what he would say to that, and this is what I was kind of going to get to, is it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, is that, well, if we were just pre-programmed, then his grace would be meaningless. It's like, oh, you're saved? Okay, well, no big deal. You were pre-programmed to be saved. So this sort of makes you have more dignity. And Descartes seems to think that our free will, our free choice, is what makes us in the image of God. So that Judeo-Christian teaching that we're made in God's image, that's what is meant by it, according to Descartes, is the fact that we're free is what makes us like God. Freedom entails the ability to understand things and to pick amongst a choice of what you're going to believe and not believe. I think this is correct. I think this is incorrect. We're free to do that, he says. And in that sense, this is kind of an interesting point he makes. He says, in that sense, we are exactly like God. We're no more or less free than God. Now, he says, obviously, God is more powerful and wise and good than us, he would say, so he can do more with his freedom. But insofar as his capacity to assert or not assert something, that is absolute in us, just as it's absolute in God. So he says our freedom is what allows us to understand, at the very little much we do, the divine nature. And so it gives us a sort of dignity, he's going to argue. So it's good to have free will, even though it leads us to error. Even though, because we're free, he says, we're able to extend our judgment beyond our understanding and make judgments about things we don't really understand, which I think he actually is doing right now. But, that's just
I
me.
actually agree with that. I think that's I think it's a good message.
Yeah.
But I think that I do think, though, that the fact that free will allows the ego, and if that makes us like God, and doesn't God have an ego? Because unless we're going with the Puritanian, like Puritan version, where people are already pre-selected and it doesn't matter how you live. Like if you live like Jesus but you don't believe in Jesus, then God doesn't want you in heaven.
Right. Well, yeah, that's definitely some Christians. Most, I guess, believe that if they're Orthodox or Catholic or Protestant. But yeah, like I would say though, don't get confused though what I mean by ego. Like I'm just saying that in a sense, the reason that I find his argument intuitive, not good, I don't think it's a good argument, but the reason I kind of want to believe it, I think is my own ego. I'm like, I want to think that I'm free because it makes me feel like I've got more, like to do with my life. If I thought everything was determined, I'd almost feel like, what does it matter, So it's almost like to save my own, and I'm kind of maybe accusing him of this a little bit, but he doesn't really seem to have an argument for free will. He just seems to assert it. Maybe I'm missing something. If somebody, maybe in your paper, you can point me in the right direction in your essay on Descartes. But to me, his argument, he tries to present something of an argument, but what he says to me seems to disprove free will, or I wouldn't say disproves it, but he gives an example, like he says, situations where you're trying to decide something and you can't decide, and you're like, your soul pulls you in one direction and another direction. He says that's not free will, but when you know without any hesitation what choice is right, that the light of nature just shows you that it's right, that is obviously free will, that's choice. And to me, I'm like, that sounds the opposite. When you're just go right to this, sounds like it was like a reflex. So again, I don't find any arguments for free will in this essay, at least any really obvious, strong ones. But he's going to say that I have it, and my free will is infinite, just like God's is. Of course, God's more powerful. He can do more with it. And that's why God wouldn't be egoistic, though, he thinks. God would be caring and would care about everything and not just caring about himself, because he's not just free, but he's also omnibenevolent, omniscient, all the good omnis, right? So, but he mentions this whole thing. Maybe there's a reason that I'd make mistakes and I just don't know it. I'll skip it because I think we've already sort of belabored this point. But the idea is that, maybe there is a good reason for all the evil stuff. I just don't know it. I mean, if you're in an art museum and you're stepping back and you look at this big painting and you see how beautiful it looks, you're like, wow, what a beautiful painting. It's not going to look beautiful if you put your face right up to it. You got your face right up to the wall, you're staring, it's going to look all blurry. So the idea is that we're stuck in our lives, which is just a small portion of the universe. If we could see the full universe that God created, the argument goes, there is a reason, right? So the answer to Job, right? There is a reason, I just can't tell you because you can't understand the universe the way that God can.
Is there a theodicy where instead of barring you from heaven, is it like a thing where unless you accept like Jesus Christ and God himself, that the devil just takes you? Like it's like, because I know that goes against a lot of like
I would say that's
faith
like
that
somebody,
the devil has any pull on God or something like that. But
well, it depends on who you ask, but I would say generally that's the general view of most Christians and some Jews, right? Depending on, that's very rare. A lot of Judaism's complicated, but the Christians, I think, and I'm not an expert on this particular aspect of Christianity, but I think they get a lot of this from the Talmud. And if you read the Talmud, you've got the notion of the story of Lucifer and the fall of the devil. And yeah, the idea is that exactly what you just said is the case. Unless you accept Christ, then you're not getting into heaven. And if you don't, Satan's got you, basically, right? He's got this repository. And then it gets more complicated in the Middle Ages. You get the notion of the purgatory that gets developed by the church. So, but, this is an interesting topic, but I feel like we're going to get really digressed a bit. And I've only got 15 minutes left. So if you want to stick around after class, we can definitely discuss it. But or maybe take my world religions class at Lone Star online next semester if you want. We can talk about it then. But yeah, he's pretty satisfied here now that he's sort of talked about why he makes mistakes, what the source of his error is, right? His free will, his ability to make judgments beyond his understanding. And so as long as he avoids that, he thinks he's in the clear. But now we're going to get to, hopefully, well, we thought we were going to get to material things. And I honestly think that this fifth meditation here, I would, if you were writing it today, I would call the title clickbait. Because, isn't that what clickbait is? Isn't it like, oh, I didn't mean to do that. It's basically got some headline to draw you in, but then you click on it and it's nothing what's promised, I feel like the title of the fifth meditation is like that, because it says, concerning the essence of material things. So you think you're finally going to get out here in the world. Remember, we're still in our minds right now for Descartes. We still haven't proven that objects out there exist. For all I know, there is no object out there. I'm just seeing a tree, and it's just all in my mind. So again, you look at the title here, and you're thinking, oh, cool, he's going to start talking about material things and get us back to the world out there. But he doesn't, right? You're not going to get there to meditation 6. But he is going to talk about God again. He's going to, through the contemplation, through thinking about the essence, what is essential about material things, this leads him to another proof for God's existence, which I have written out here. I shouldn't even show you that yet, because it'll probably just confuse you. We'll get to that in a minute. But let's see how this works, right? It's not going to take us that long, so don't worry. We'll get out on time. He starts out, contemplating the things out there. And he says, I don't know if they exist. Maybe there aren't any things out there. Maybe it's all in my mind. I want to believe in them because it's kind of absurd to think everything's in your head. But right now I can't prove anything. But let's just look at them. What do I know about them? They do have certain shapes to them, okay? So I know these things about shapes. And then he starts to contemplate what he knows about a triangle. And he says, well, there are things that are true about a triangle. And whether or not there's an actual triangle out there in the world, these things will still be true. And so the truth of these things do not depend upon me. And there's something essential about triangles and other shapes and things that aren't in me or dependent upon me and just are true. Okay, and so let's see what he says about this and how does this lead to a proof for God's existence. And this is at the bottom, the very bottom of page 42. So now we're finally in meditation 5. He says, what I believe must be considered above all here is the fact that I find within me countless ideas of certain things, and that even if perhaps they do not exist anywhere outside me, they still cannot be said to be nothing. And although in a sense I think them at will, nevertheless they are not something I have fabricated. Rather, they have their own true and immutable natures. For example, when I imagine a triangle, even if perhaps no such figure exists outside my thought anywhere in the world, and never has, the triangle still has a certain determinate nature, essence, or form, which is unchangeable and eternal, which I did not fabricate, and which does not depend upon my mind. This is evident from the fact that various properties can be demonstrated regarding this triangle. Namely, that it has 3 angles that are equal to 2 right angles, that its longest side is opposite its largest angle, and so on. These are properties I now clearly acknowledge whether I want to or not, even if I have previously given them no thought whatsoever when I imagined the triangle. For this reason, they were not fabricated by me. Okay? So again, I didn't cause a triangle to have 3 angles that add up to 180 degrees. They just do. They just add up to 2 right angles. I didn't cause triangles to have the larger side being across from the largest angle. That's just how triangles are. And furthermore, I can't just make it otherwise. I can't imagine a triangle. Can you imagine a triangle with 4 sides? Can you imagine a triangle with the largest angle not being across from the largest side?
Not really.
Yeah, he says you're not. Well, if you do, you're not imagining a triangle. You know, you're imagining something else. So that truth of that does not depend on you, doesn't depend on me. It just is. And so he says it's irrelevant for me to say. Furthermore, it's irrelevant for me to say that perhaps the idea of the triangle came to me from external things through the sense organs, because of course I have on occasion seen triangle-shaped bodies. For I can think of countless other figures concerning which there can be no suspicion of their ever having entered me through the senses, and yet I can demonstrate various properties of these figures no less than I can of the triangle. Okay, it's not clear what he's talking about here because he doesn't really give us an example, but he says, look, even if you want to say that I only know triangles through senses of the triangle, he's like, well, no, the things that are true about triangles aren't true because of my senses. They're just true. They're just right. Okay, this is very rationalist here. And furthermore, there are things that are true that definitely didn't come from my senses. Like I said, he doesn't give us an example here, but he actually does in Meditation 6. He mentions something that would fit the example here. He talks about a shape, and I can't remember the name of it, but I want to say it's a chiliagon or chililiagon or something like this. I've never heard of it before until I read Descartes, but apparently a chililiagon is a 100-sided shape. It has 100 sides. So he says, have you ever seen that shape? Can you imagine it? Like, I can't. I'm trying to picture a shape that has 100 sides. It just looks like a circle to me with a bunch of ridges, you know, like just, you know. So for him, he's like, there's things that are true about that shape, and that didn't come from my senses. And he says, all these properties are patently true, right? The things that are true of the 100-sided shape, the things that are true of squares, rectangles, triangles. He says, these are patently true because I know them clearly, and thus they are something and not merely nothing. For it's obvious that whatever is true is something, and I've already demonstrated at some length that all that I know clearly is true. We kind of glossed over that, but Descartes does say that everything I know clearly and distinctly must be true. The fact that because I think I exist, that's clear, it's distinct, it's its own truth, so it must be true, it's certain. That'll actually come back to bite him later on. We're going to see that when we get to Meditation 6. But what is he saying here? Just to repeat the sort of point, and how does this lead to a proof for God's existence? Well, he says, I can't think of a triangle. I can't imagine a triangle without imagining a three-sided shape. And I can't imagine a triangle that has angles that aren't equal to 180 degrees. So that's something that's essential about being a triangle, right? You can't have a triangle without three sides. Now he's going to say that there's something similar that applies to the essence of what it means to be God. He says, given the definition of God, you can't imagine God without the quality of existence. Just like you can't imagine a triangle without three sides, or a square without four sides, or all these other things. That's just the way they are. God implies existence. How does that follow, I wonder? It's very similar to the argument he used earlier to show God wasn't a deceiver, right? God couldn't be a deceiver because he's perfect, and perfection implies no deception. If you deceive, that's an imperfection. So why does the idea of God entail existence? Kind of the same reason. He says perfection. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess why else? Like, how else? I mean, I guess he's assuming how else do we get here except for something so infinitely powerful making this, I guess.
Well, that's more of the argument we got from the third meditation. It's sort of like there can't be an infinite regress of all these things. Like the idea of God couldn't be caused by another idea, because that'd be caused by another idea and another idea. And there had to be something actual that actually caused it. But this is more of like a rational argument. You're just trying to understand the concept of God, and by reflecting on the concept of God, you arrive at the existence of God. And this argument, I have it sort of simplified here, just to sort of break it down. This is not how it's presented by Descartes, but this argument is known in the philosophical literature as the ontological argument. Ontological, that means having to do with being. Ontology is the study of being. And so this argument actually is an old argument. Descartes, you can say, is sort of ripping it off from St. Anselm. And it's an old argument that had been kind of buried in the past. And to be honest, most of the Christian scholars did not take it very seriously and didn't like it. It was sort of resuscitated and revitalized through Descartes. And now, again, we still talk about it, but most philosophers seem to find it very flawed. But let's go over it. What is he basically saying here? So here it is broken down into a very simple form. You got two premises, and they established this conclusion. The first premise says that God is the perfect being. Okay, so, well, perfection implies existence. If you don't exist, you can't be perfect. Non-existence implies lack of perfection. So therefore, God must necessarily exist.
So what about people? Like, what about humans?
We don't necessarily exist. We don't necessarily, and we're not perfect. So this argument only applies to God. So I mean, yeah, go ahead.
But then if his mind exists, but his mind isn't perfect because it doubts constantly or is unsure, then how does he know his mind exists?
Because he's thinking, right? He's like, my mind exists because I'm thinking. How could I be thinking if I didn't exist? Basically, that's his argument. But this idea about, he says, I forget exactly how you started off there. I kind of lost your thread. You were saying, hold on. Yeah, so basically, and maybe I could tell you a little bit about the way that some of the contemporaries reacted to St. Anselm. It seems like Spinoza, Leibniz, some of the other philosophers that were alive at the same time that Descartes were, or shortly thereafter, they kind of accepted this argument. But when St. Anselm was originating it, it didn't really, some people liked it, some people didn't, and it was still controversial. And his critics were like, look, I mean, you're saying, look, we're finite, we're not perfect, we make flaws. How do we come about? Well, God created us, and the only reason that we know that, well, one reason, remember, one argument is that the fact that we're finite, the fact that we're imperfect, and yet we still have an idea of God in us, that idea got there somehow, and it couldn't have got there from ourselves, Descartes argues, so it must have been placed there by a being that was perfect and infinite. So that's the argument from the earlier meditation. But here what he's saying is that, look, if you've got a being that is absolutely perfect, that being must exist. There's no way that the being could be perfect if it didn't exist. And the way that like I was about to say, the critics against Anselm, they would laugh at him, and they were Christian, they were faithful, they believed in Jesus and all that, they believed in God, but they said, this doesn't work, Anselm, this argument doesn't work. If you use this argument, then I could just say something like this. I could say, I have this idea of a perfect island, this perfect island that has perfect weather all year round. It's beautiful. There's fruit growing from the trees. All this, the life there is wonderful. It's fun and amusing. It's a paradise, and it's perfect. And so it's a perfect island. Perfection implies existence. So therefore, my island that I just thought of exists. And Anselm says, no, you don't understand my argument. This only applies to God, because God is the only being that is perfect. God is the only concept that we have like that. Triangles are just triangles. Squares are just squares. Human minds are just human minds. But God is perfect, infinite, eternal, all these great things. The way, and I don't think it's a good argument, but let me try to help it a little bit before I give you my critique. The way Anselm presents it is maybe a little bit more persuasive. He talks about how, look, some things are heavier than others, and some things are lighter than others. So somewhere in the universe, there's got to be something that's the heaviest thing, right? And some things are salty and some things are less salty. So there's got to be something in the universe that's the saltiest thing in the universe. So by that logic, there's got to be one being that is the greatest being in the entire universe. That which nothing else can be conceived that's greater. That's kind of how he puts it. And so if there is such a being, he would have to exist. Otherwise, he wouldn't be the greatest being of all time. My problem with that argument is, what does that even mean, the greatest being of all? I know what he means by the heaviest. We're talking about weight, or the lightest, lack of weight, or the strongest, or the sharpest, or whatever, but just the best of what? Just best in general? What does that even mean? And so it seems like he's just making up a word or a concept. It doesn't necessarily
Not just that, but like, why does that have to be the Christian? Like, why does it have to be specifically the Christian God?
No, he admits that he admits at this point in the argument, he admits that he has not proven the Christian God. He's like, all I've proven is the, perfect, infinite, he's got a ways to go before we get, to Jesus Christ being your savior. He's not trying to do that. He's trying to defeat the atheist. He's trying to defeat the skeptic. But yeah, you're right. You're right to point that out. Yeah, all he's done. But even then, I don't think he's proven God. I have Kant. He's a famous philosopher. I have Kant's last name written down here. And Kant was a believer. At least he said he was Christian. And he said that Kant made this, and I think he's kind of right about this. He says, well, this argument doesn't really prove that God exists. All it says that if God existed, he would necessarily exist. Like if there were a perfect being, he would have to exist to be perfect. So yeah, but it doesn't really prove it. I mean, think about it this way. Let's say you're a skeptic and you don't believe in God, and someone says, I can prove him. You'd be like, oh, really? Well, I'm all ears. Let me hear it. You might give him some grief for this first premise. The moment that the words God is comes out of his mouth, you might push back and say, why are you saying all this stuff and asserting all this stuff about God when you haven't even proven him yet? That's like me trying to prove my, my perfect island. You're like, prove that this perfect island exists. Well, it's got perfect trees. Dude, you haven't even shown me it's there yet. So, in order for go ahead.
Or if there's this, I guess, a dimension of perfect forms, and you could say that the reason why people can experience certain things beyond earthly forms once they leave, or once the spirit leaves, because the spirit, like maybe the spirit goes back to that to that other dimension, that other existence. Maybe that where God, if God is in that world, in that dimension, maybe what existence means there is not what existence means here. It can, like you said, we don't really understand it.
Right.
So like, can God be the most, or is God simply, maybe God is that other dimension? Maybe God is that other, that all the forms.
In a way, and I don't want to say this with too much confidence, because I think Descartes, he kind of avoided these questions as much as he could. He tried to keep it pretty straight and straightforward when it came to metaphysical stuff and not get into the details too much. But I would assume that he's going to probably be right with you there. Like, his notion of God is going to be ultimately incomprehensible and outside of sort of our realm of experience. So if God does exist, he probably would concur. I think, and again, I wouldn't want to say it with too much confidence, but I'd be pretty likely that Descartes would agree with you that, yeah, that God does exist, but his existence is something beyond our sort of existence, and that we could never really fully fathom it. You know, it might be in this other Platonic realm, as you say, this outside of time and space. And I think he would definitely be, at least if he didn't believe it, I think he'd at least be very, what's the word I'm looking for, open to that view. But I think honestly, though, that is going to come back to bite him, because he seems to be, part of his argument for God is that he has a clear, distinct idea of God. But does he really have a clear and distinct idea of God? It seems like God is something that's beyond understanding. So what's so darn clear about it? Sounds like a pretty, it's supposed to be beyond understanding. Humans are, incapable, so great that no one can fathom it. So I think that you're going to see that when we get to the sixth meditation, that this notion of, if it's clear and distinct, I know it's certain, but that yet God is just this vague entity. It's like, well, which one is it, right? I better not get into the details too much of that problem, though, because it gets kind of complicated, and it's really mainly the main thing we're going to be focusing on next class. So I'll save it for next time. But yeah, you're bringing up some really good objections for sure. And I don't honestly, and maybe I'm being unfair to Descartes, because I'm honestly not a huge fan of Descartes. I think he was a brilliant man. I think this is a fun reading, but as a philosopher, I'm not a big fan of his, right? So, but let's, I love your objection. So maybe that's why. Maybe because I don't like him, I'm kind of taking your side. But we'll explore this in much more detail next time. All next week will be devoted to wrapping up Descartes and moving on to Jean-Paul Sartre. So I'll go ahead and stop the meeting now. I'm going to end the recording.